Rigid mechanical phrases. Artificial transitions. Awkward and monotonous passage work. And bloated proportions. These are some of the criticisms leveled against Tchaikovsky's later piano concertos. Yes, he wrote 3 sequels to the first one, but they're mostly ignored today. By contrast, Tchaikovsky's first was the 4th most programmed piano concerto across nearly 17,000 concerts analyzed by Bachtrack.com in 2025. His next best-known piano concerto, the second, isn't even close in popularity. In a survey of over 200 American orchestras from 2021 through 2024, Tchaikovsky's first concerto was programmed on 67 concert cycles, compared to just 2 for the second concerto and none for his other piano and orchestra works. Currently available commercial recordings paint a similar picture. The disparity is huge. Why don't we hear more of Tchaikovsky's later piano concertos? Is it a fluke of reception history, or are they really that much worse than the first? This video is brought to you by Amadeus Apparel, where you can get shirts inspired by composers who actually do have multiple piano concertos in the standard repertoire. Save 10% with the link in the description. All of Tchaikovsky's later piano concertos have positive qualities, but they've also faced significant criticism from audiences, scholars, performers, even Tchaikovsky himself, who freely admitted that the second concerto is too long. The first to report this was Sergei Taneyev, the soloist for the concerto's 1882 Russian premiere. Everyone he spoke with after the performance agreed that the first and second movements had outstayed their welcome. For example, Taneyev called Tchaikovsky's attention to the 4 pages of alternating chords in one of the first movement cadenzas, writing, "They are very difficult to play, though this is not readily apparent in performance. I think the audience will get slightly bored by the end of the second page, and by the end of the 4th will begin to lose its patience." Though the first movement was actually similar in duration to that of the first concerto, around 20 minutes, its less convincing material made its length less palatable. For Tchaikovsky scholar David Brown, the second-rate and chunky opening theme collapses into impotence in its 4th 2-bar phrase. Jeremy Norris, author of a scholarly book on 19th century Russian piano concertos, described the themes as colorless, with an often brutally written piano part. The lyrical second movement, nearly 14 minutes long, features an unusual triple concerto dialogue between the pianist, concertmaster, and principal cellist. The melodic writing is stronger than in the first movement, but for Brown, it all breaks down in the central section, where a series of mounting sequences culminates in what he calls pointless violin and cello cadenzas. While the piano trio idea is interesting for the middle movement of a concerto, it comes at the cost of reducing the main soloist's role to an accompanist or even a bystander for long stretches. Taneyev reported after the premiere that few people approved of the violin and cello solos. They say the piano has nothing to do in it. Meanwhile, the exciting finale is the shortest and most successful of the group. Still, it's the propulsive rhythm that seems to generate more interest than any particular melodic idea. As the critic Eric Blom concluded, the G major contains little we are tempted to hum on leaving the concert room, much less while occupying the bathroom. Tchaikovsky was already worried about the work's fate months before its Russian premiere in 1882, as he wrote, "No one is playing the piano concerto. In short, this is bad." His next attempt in the genre was an 1884 Concert Fantasia in 2 movements. Its crippling weakness, according to David Brown, is that it contains not one really strong idea. The first movement does have some fun passages introduced by the flute and taken up by the piano. But after just a few minutes, Tchaikovsky made the bizarre decision to insert a colossal 8-minute cadenza. Norris points out that since it's based on new material, the cadenza loses its normal function of reiterating prominent themes at the end of a large movement. It's so long that the 19th century American critic James Huneker wrote, "The audience is apt to forget there is an orchestra, and if the cadenza were cut or omitted, the fantasy would certainly be heard oftener, but who will play the surgeon?" As for the second movement, based around 2 contrasting ideas, Tchaikovsky twice called the themes repugnant, a promising start. In fact, he had recently rejected this material as the first movement of his 3rd orchestral suite, recycling it into the Concert Fantasia instead. For Norris, the result was a series of self-contained, ballet-like melodies that were pleasant but unsuitable for development in a broader concerto form. Tchaikovsky later attempted a similar conversion after abandoning drafts for an E-flat symphony in 1892, explaining that the symphony was merely written for the sake of having something to write. There's nothing at all interesting or appealing in it. He then promised to destroy it, but instead turned it into a 3rd piano concerto by transcribing certain orchestral parts for the soloist. This worked surprisingly well for the first movement. Still, Taneyev thought it lacked virtuosity for a proper concerto. Most of the pianistic fireworks happen in the first part of the cadenza, but are spread more thinly elsewhere. Tchaikovsky, too, was skeptical, calling the effort not bad as music, but pretty ungrateful, and again threatened to destroy it before deciding to keep only the first movement as a standalone concert piece. But he died a few weeks after orchestrating it in 1893, and this concerto never received much attention. Taneyev premiered it in St. Petersburg just over a year later, to little success. He was called back only once. By the end of the 19th century, the fates of Tchaikovsky's 4 piano concertos were more or less sealed. The first concerto was widely played and had been internationally championed by notable pianists including Hans von Bülow, who had given its 1875 premiere to great success in Boston. The second had its advocates, but was too long, prompting some drastic, unauthorized cuts by the pianist Alexander Sulati that shaved off some 30 pages, which didn't make it much more convincing than the original. The experimental Concert Fantasia, with its random mega cadenza in the first movement, enjoyed some early success that ultimately didn't last, and the posthumous single-movement third concerto never really stood a fair chance against the standard, full-length concertos that premiered in Tchaikovsky's lifetime. So where did it all go wrong? Did Tchaikovsky just suddenly forget how to write piano concertos after his first? In an 1878 letter, Tchaikovsky recognized how rarely a composition emerged equally beautiful in every part. There were almost always seams, patches, unevenness where the music had been stitched together, whether from breaks in the creative process or lapses in inspiration. For Jeremy Norris, Tchaikovsky succeeded in hiding those episodic seams in the first concerto, but avoided or failed to do so convincingly in all his other works for piano and orchestra. For instance, Norris points out the seamless transition between subjects in the first concerto, where the episode based on a Ukrainian folk song dies down into a growling, broken octave pattern. At this point, Tchaikovsky starts to tease out the relationship between this pattern and the beginning of the next subject, a process that Norris calls dovetailing the themes. But the links between melodies in the first concerto don't end there. The end of this phrase from the second subject recalls the motif played by the horn at the beginning of the concerto. In fact, analysis by Alexander Alexeyev in 1969, later expanded on by David Brown, revealed a vast network of interconnections between the concerto's many melodies. While the famous introductory theme never returns in full, fragments of it are scattered throughout the concerto. Even parts of melodies that Tchaikovsky borrowed, such as the Ukrainian tune in the first movement and a popular French song in the second, share certain contours with the opening episode. Norris shows how even some virtuosic figures in the piano part have their possible genesis in the opening orchestration. Of course, no one walks away from this concerto thinking, wow, I love how the upward triplets of the opening cadenza foreshadow the culminating octaves after the second subject. But the many subtle relationships between the themes and the episodes of this concerto gave Tchaikovsky plenty of opportunities, whether by careful design or by intuition, to create a concerto full of big tunes that sound like they belong together, within a large-scale form that never drags or shifts too abruptly. But for whatever reason, Tchaikovsky never again wrote a piano concerto movement with the same kind of seamless, organic design. The transition between subjects in the Second Concerto's opening movement is no more than a crude jolt into E-flat major. And then there's the giant cadenza from the Concert Fantasia's first movement, which is almost an independent piece with its own thematic motto. It does find subtle ways to blend in previous material, especially the 3 pickup notes from this elegant phrase, which becomes integrated into a really cool Schumann-esque episode. But when it's all said and done, the return to the opening material just falls flat by comparison. We went through 8 minutes of gripping, virtuosic development just to hear a 3-minute recap of the same lightweight melodies from the beginning. Then the next movement takes the idea of contrasts to an extreme. Just like in the first concerto, Tchaikovsky dovetails the end of the first subject with the beginning of the second, only this time it sounds like trying to mix oil with water. Elsewhere, Brown also identifies some awkwardness in the hasty transition of the third concerto, which interestingly makes the same daring leap between subjects as the second concerto, only now in reverse, from E-flat to G. Besides the structure of the music, there may be reason to blame Tchaikovsky's inconsistent piano concerto output on his lack of ability at the piano and the criticism it drew from his colleagues. He could play fairly well, but he didn't consider himself a pianist, a qualification that other standard rep piano concerto composers tend to have. In particular, it was concert-level piano music that seemed to be a challenge for Tchaikovsky. His most successful solo works were miniatures and character pieces intended for the salon. On the other hand, his polarizing Grand Sonata in G has never been a standard choice for pianists, and David Brown even considered it a strong candidate as the dullest piece Tchaikovsky ever wrote. Scholar Edward Garden went so far as to conclude that Tchaikovsky was incapable of being inspired by the piano as an instrument. The success of the first piano concerto can be attributed to the fact he was not thinking in terms of the piano at all, but of the orchestra. All of the themes are conceived in their orchestral form. Tchaikovsky seemed to resort to this orchestral piano writing out of necessity. While composing the first concerto, he wrote, "I force my brain to think out piano passages." Later, he explained his need to consult some virtuoso as to what might be ineffective, impracticable, and ungrateful in my technique. I needed a severe but at the same time friendly critic to point out in my work these extreme blemishes only. In 1874, the man he sought out for severe yet friendly criticism of his newly completed first concerto was Nikolai Rubinstein, the best pianist in Moscow. But Rubinstein's incendiary response upon hearing the bold new work became one of the more traumatic professional experiences in Tchaikovsky's life. Rubinstein called it worthless, unplayable, and considered only a few pages worth saving. In defiance, Tchaikovsky vowed not to change a single note and had it published as it was in 1875. It was only after the premiere that he considered making some alterations to the piano part, fielding suggestions from pianists to make the writing more effective and idiomatic. For example, the opening piano chords were originally notated as arpeggios, less audible beneath the orchestra. The second edition slightly refined them, and in the third version they became the solid, more powerful chords that we know today, taking advantage of the piano's full range and helping it stand out more from the orchestra. Ultimately, the awkward piano writing in parts of the first concerto didn't derail its long-term reception. But if Tchaikovsky was already insecure about his piano concerto writing, and a musician he genuinely respected in Nikolai Rubinstein trashed his first attempt, then it's easy to imagine why he never wrote another concerto quite like his first. Edward Garden observed, "It is clear that after Rubinstein's severe strictures about the piano part in the first concerto, Tchaikovsky in the second was sincerely trying to compose in terms of the piano rather than the orchestra, and it may be that this was partially responsible for the manifest inferiority of the later work." After finishing the second concerto in 1880, Tchaikovsky sent it once again to Rubinstein, who would become the work's dedicatee and planned soloist for the premiere. Rubinstein at first gave no feedback. Then he admitted to scarcely reading the concerto once through and thought it was too episodic, a fair point given its abrupt transitions, and that the piano didn't stand out from the orchestra, which Tchaikovsky rightfully disagreed with. But when Rubinstein suddenly died, the premiere was delayed. Although he had eventually come around to the first concerto and even performed it himself, Rubinstein never gave Tchaikovsky the closure of publicly approving and premiering the second concerto. Tchaikovsky was initially proud of the work, but when Taneyev reported after the 1882 premiere that everyone thought it was too long, Tchaikovsky replied, "I regret that those persons to whom it was entrusted 2 years ago for critical scrutiny, Rubinstein and Taneyev, didn't indicate this failing at the proper time." After that experience, Tchaikovsky never again attempted to compose a 3-movement piano concerto from scratch. In contrast to the first 2 concertos, the Concert Fantasia reads like a kind of rebellion, declaring freedom from typical concerto form with movements titled quasi-rondo and contrasts that attest to their experimental forms. Meanwhile, the third concerto was rather bizarrely recycled from an abandoned symphony, not originally composed with the piano in mind at all. In the final weeks of his life, Tchaikovsky lost his nerve in making it a full 3-movement concerto, deeming it too long, which it wasn't. The latter 2 movements of the third concerto, consisting of unorchestrated sketches, were later completed and performed by Taneyev after the composer's death. But a letter from Tchaikovsky shows that he at one point intended the first movement to be published alone, and that it would comprise the whole concerto. Had he lived longer, he very possibly could have changed his mind once again. The single-movement third concerto was arguably his most promising and cohesive piano and orchestra work since the first. For Norris, 2 complementary movements of equal stature would have earned this concerto a place in the standard repertoire. The strange arc of Tchaikovsky's 4 piano concertos reveals much that the first concerto alone does not. It makes us better appreciate the miraculous success of that first concerto, written by a non-pianist with no prior experience in the genre. It shows us how seriously Tchaikovsky took feedback from his colleagues, who were often brutally honest, or in one case, honestly brutal, and how it could have impacted his later efforts. We find curious cases of Tchaikovsky's strength as a melodist clashing with his self-admitted struggles in large-scale forms. We see his willingness to experiment with novel structures, cadenzas, and textures. We also find him thrifting and recycling old materials in unlikely ways. Overall, we see how messy composing could really be for him, even as someone who churned out so many beloved warhorses in practically every genre. Concert givers and concert goers have conspired to make certain piano concertos distressingly well known to us, wrote the American author Henry Bellman in 1921. Upon mentioning Tchaikovsky's dominant first concerto, Bellman asked, "Why not the other one sometimes? The second. It tosses its mane less dramatically and paws the earth in less fiery manner, but it is beautiful in quite its own way." Many pianists have taken up Bellman's challenge. Today, one of them is former Chopin competition winner Bruce Liu, who as of 2026 is on tour with all 3 of Tchaikovsky's numbered concertos. On August 20th, 2025, he played the full version of the second concerto to a sold-out Royal Albert Hall.
Why do you think it's not had the same level of popularity as the first?
That's a very good question. I think it's, life is like a snowball, For some reason it gets famous, and then the more it gets played, the more famous it gets, and the opposite is the opposite. So I believe it's extremely hard, the first movement, technically demanding, and but for people who has listened to it, I think it's a total different opinion that why this should not be played more often and heard often,
Comments on recordings of these concertos often express striking enthusiasm for the music, with listeners calling them underrated, superior to the first, even some of the best things Tchaikovsky wrote. It illustrates that even while scholarly critiques can explain the fundamental differences between these concertos, they ultimately don't dictate whether we enjoy hearing them or not. After all, they're still works by Tchaikovsky. Gazing into the musical past can be as overwhelming as an illuminated night sky. With so much music to explore, it's only natural we gravitate towards the brightest stars of the repertoire. But if we squint our eyes a bit and get to know their less luminous companions, then we can step back and appreciate the striking constellations they form together.